Therapy Chat Podcast, episode 79.
This is the Therapy Chat Podcast with Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C.
Today's episode is sponsored by Therapy Notes. If you're a therapist and you're looking for a practice management system that does it all, Therapy Notes might be right for you. Therapy Notes can manage your schedule, your electronic health record, all your documentation of client sessions. I could not run my practice without a practice management system. If you stay tuned at the end of this episode, you will hear how you can save 10% on Therapy Notes. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. I'm your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C, and in this episode, I am so thrilled to bring you an interview with someone who is doing amazing work in bringing awareness to the issue of trauma, childhood trauma, trauma in development, and how it affects our physical and emotional health over our entire lives. If you've listened to Therapy Chat Podcast, you know that I am passionate about trauma and about helping people understand the significance of childhood trauma in particular to our lifelong well-being. And I've talked about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is called ACEs, and I'm constantly helping my clients understand why it matters that they've experienced childhood trauma, because everyone wants to believe that what happens in childhood is pretty much forgotten. You become an adult and you put it all behind you. And that would be great if it were true, but it isn't true. What happens to our developing brains as a result of the stress of childhood trauma continues to affect us physically, mentally, and emotionally for our whole lives. Now, if you've experienced childhood trauma and you fear that you will be changed forever because of it and that there's no hope for healing, please know that that's not true. The truth is that once you address the trauma, you can heal the effects that it's had. Of course, there are certain things that once they've happened, they can't be reversed. If you develop a chronic illness that relates to the stress and trauma you experienced in childhood, healing the trauma may not take away the illness, but it can often help reduce the symptoms and have you functioning and living more well, even with that illness. So for me, while some people might see childhood trauma as a depressing subject, I see it as something that it's really hopeful, because if you realize the impact, then you learn that it can change. And the earlier we intervene to help children who have experienced trauma, the better. But it's never too late to address the effects of childhood trauma. And that's why I'm so thrilled to bring you my guest today, who has been speaking for years, decades, about the effects of childhood traumatic stress. He's an internationally known speaker and author, and someone I admire immensely. My guest today is Dr. Gabor Maté. Gabor Maté has a TED Talk called The Power of Addiction and the Addiction to Power, and he has several best-selling books. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts is about how trauma and addiction are related. When the Body Says No is about how physical illness and trauma are related. And Scattered Minds is about how trauma and ADD or ADHD are related. He also has a book co-authored with Dr. Gordon Neufeld, who is an international authority on child development, called Hold On to Your Kids. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to let you hear my interview with Dr. Gabor Maté. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. I'm so excited for the conversation that we are about to have today. I have a very special guest today, Dr. Gabor Maté. Dr. Maté, thank you so much for being on Therapy Chat today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, I think the pleasure's all mine, but I'm so thrilled to share this message that you have about childhood trauma. It's a huge passion of mine. And I first learned about your work through your TED Talk, which is called The Power of Addiction and the Addiction of Power. And in that, you connect addiction to the need for love and belonging that wasn't met, which is also a theme of many of your books, maybe all of your books. So can you kind of tell us a little bit more about your books and your work?
Sure. So I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I'm a medical doctor. I retired from clinical practice for a few years, but I'm busy teaching and traveling and speaking internationally, and I've written these 4 books. What I learned in over 3 decades of medical work, which included a family practice, delivering a lot of babies, palliative care work. I was for 7 years coordinator of a palliative care unit at Vancouver's largest hospital. And then I worked for 12 years in Vancouver's downtown Eastside, which you might say is ground zero for addictions in North America. We have more addicted people in a few square block radius than anywhere else in North America. Mm. And what I've learned in all that work is that whatever malaise, affliction, disease, mental illness, addictive patterns, diagnoses people have, the common denominator for most of the clinical problems that people face, whether in physical or mental illness, is childhood experience, childhood emotional loss, and in many cases, overt childhood trauma. And that those early experiences shape our personalities, how we relate to the world, our physiology, and particularly the physiology of our brains. And so therefore, in trying to deal with a problem like addiction or say ADHD, which I've been diagnosed myself, or depression, or for that matter, rheumatoid arthritis or scleroderma or cancer or any chronic condition. It's not enough to look at the physiology. We also have to look at the interaction of physiology and the person's emotional experience in life, beginning from within the womb, actually. That would be in a nutshell what my message has been and what I've learned.
It's so powerful because what you're saying is that we can totally change the way we look at disease as something that can be really preventable if we would address childhood trauma.
Yes. If you look at the vast literature on addiction, for example, it's completely clear that addiction is rooted in childhood emotional loss and trauma. Now, we'll have to discuss what trauma is because people have very rigid or limited understanding of what trauma is. But yes, if we understood that addiction is rooted in childhood trauma, which is conditioned by social and economic and cultural factors as well, but if we understood that, we'd have a very different approach to the prevention of addiction and also to the treatment of it. But in my book on addiction, which is entitled In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, in my appendix on prevention, I say that the prevention of addiction needs to begin at the very first prenatal visit.
Wow. So is it possible to explain here how that would start right there at that first prenatal visit?
Yes. So there's, again, a vast body of research information now that shows that stresses on the pregnant woman are transmitted to the child, to the embryo, to the fetus, to the developing child, and that those stresses affect the development of the child's brain and predict for increased risk of learning difficulties, ADHD, and addiction later on in the child. So when you stress pregnant women, they'll have high levels of stress hormones, or pregnant animals in the laboratory for that matter, and they'll have high levels of stress hormones. Those stress hormones, of course, are infused into the infant through the placenta, and those have an impact on the child's brain development, a negative impact. So that if you say stress pregnant animals in a laboratory, their offspring as adults will be more likely to soothe themselves with cocaine and alcohol when that's provided to them. We also know that mothers who are stressed during pregnancy, their infants after birth and long after birth will have abnormal levels of stress hormones, and those affect brain development. In other words, it's necessary to look at the very beginnings of human life to understand what happens to human beings later on, which incidentally is not all that controversial when you think about it. If you're growing plants in your backyard, if you wanted healthy adult plants, you make sure that they have the seed is planted in the best possible soil and receive the best possible nutrition and irrigation and sunlight and whatever tending it requires. So why would it be surprising that human beings are the same way? Human beings are also implanted. The seed is implanted in a uterus, just as a seed is implanted in the earth. Why is it strange to recognize that the conditions in that environment will have a huge impact on how that organism develops? It's just straightforward biology.
Yes, it's really so obvious, and for some reason we just ignore that reality and slowly say, oh, so what we eat and what we, the chemicals in the air and the stress and all those things affect the developing baby. That's strange.
Well, you see, all that's true. So that women who grow up in polluted areas, their children will have more learning problems in schools. And we know that from studies, for example, in New York City. But of course, it's not just the physical environment that affects the physiology of the infant. It's also the emotional environment. Because in the placenta, again, the mother's physiology becomes the child's physiology. The mother is stressed, the infant is stressed. And that continues even after birth. For example, we know from many studies that the more stressed the parents are, the more likely the child is to have asthma. So stressed parents, and the more stressed the parents are, the more likely the child may require more medications or hospitalization for their asthma. Now we know this. It's not controversial. It's been published over and over and over again. Or, for example, a study last year in the U.S. showed that the more episodes of racism a black woman experiences, the greater her risk of asthma. In other words, there's a real connection between our emotional lives and our physiology. And that's straightforward as well. There's pure science, nothing controversial about it. It's only that we don't draw those conclusions. When I say we, the medical profession and society in general does not make those connections. Scientifically, the connections are obvious and straightforward and easily explainable. The problem is we separate the mind from the body, we separate the individual from the environment, and then we have no real explanation for why people are getting sick. Why, for example, the increasing epidemic of asthma in our society, or the increasing epidemic of ADHD, or the increasing rise in addictions and so on. But if we get that people's emotional lives from conception onwards affects their physiology, and that people's emotional lives occur in a context of family, neighborhood, community, society as a whole, economics, culture, politics, then in order to understand human illness, dysfunction, mental problems, we have to look at the larger picture and make all these connections.
That's so true. And I think people often overlook living in poverty as an intense stressor on its own. Even if it's not a violent community, people look at poverty and violence as going hand in hand in cities, but people who live in poverty and there's not violence, it's still traumatic. Well,
it's traumatic depending where you are. Certainly in our society, it's traumatic for a whole lot of reasons. But there's, again, tremendous amount of research that shows that when people are in poverty, they're much more stressed. So it's not the deprivation per se, unless it's extreme, that causes the problems. It's the stress of living in a society where poverty is almost a sin, and people don't have the social cohesion to pull together and work together and support one another, and where success is celebrated as being a marker of human value. In a society like that, poverty is very stressful, and it's the stress then that affects the child's brain development. So there's many, many studies that show the negative impact of poverty on learning capacity, on emotional regulation, on behavior, and on mental illness. But poverty is only one particular stress. And in our society, there are many, many stresses that affect people who don't live in poverty. And these people also suffer.
Absolutely. So let's go back to when you said that we should discuss what trauma is, because people do have a certain perception of what trauma is. I know when I speak with people and I ask them about a history of trauma, most people will say that they haven't experienced anything traumatic. But when I ask them about specific things that could have been traumatic, they'll say that those things have happened, but they don't consider them traumas. So how do you define trauma?
See, I was talking last night to actually a social worker in Detroit who's in her 60s. And her therapist has been telling her for a while that she's been traumatized. But this woman says, no, I wasn't. Then I ask her about her childhood, and it turns out that her father and mother used to beat her with a belt. Mm-hmm. Just to mention one of the things that happened to her. But she says, that was normal at the time, so I wasn't traumatized. So if you ask her a history of trauma, she'll say, no, I wasn't traumatized. If you ask her, were you ever hit? Yes, I was hit with a belt. So that's because people understand trauma as something that happens to other people. And people understand trauma as something horrible happening, like sexual abuse or terrible neglect or watching somebody die or something really extreme. So what we have to understand is that trauma is not what happens externally. So trauma is not the sexual abuse. Trauma is not the being hit with a belt. Trauma is not watching somebody close to you be murdered. That's not what the trauma is. The trauma is what happens inside you as a result of that event. And what happens inside you is that you experience all kinds of emotions, such as rage, such as terror, such as fear, such as grief, that then change you. They change you because in order to deal with those difficult emotions, which are responses to life events, we have to be able to feel those emotions and express them. When these events occur in an environment where the child has no capacity to express herself, to be heard, received, validated, and soothed, then those emotions become frozen in the body and the brain, basically. And so the trauma is the freezing of emotions. And emotion really means energy in motion. So that when you freeze that, now you've got trauma in a sense that in the future, your reactions and responses will be limited. They'll be conditioned by what happened to you in the past. So trauma is that freezing of the normal response to difficult events. The trauma is not the difficult events themselves. It's the freezing of our response to it, which inevitably results in a disconnection from ourselves. So people who are traumatized get disconnected from their feelings and from their bodies because they couldn't express it, because it was overwhelming for them. The only way to endure that traumatic experience is to disconnect. It's a form of defense. So actually what trauma is a normal response to an abnormal situation. And when that happens over time, that becomes ingrained in the body and the brain and the psychology and the physiology of the individual. So that's one aspect of trauma. Now there's another aspect of trauma, which some people call small t trauma, but a better phrase for it is developmental trauma. Mm-hmm. So the great British child psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott talked about two things that can go wrong in childhood. One is when things happen that shouldn't happen. And that's the rape, that's the sexual abuse, that's the beating, that's the neglect. But he says something else can go wrong when things that should happen don't happen. In other words, we can be traumatized when we experience events that shouldn't have happened, but we can also be traumatized when we don't experience what should have happened. And if you look at the necessary conditions for healthy brain development, there's actually a wonderful research article in the Journal of Pediatrics that was published just 4 years ago now. And this article is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And it's called an Integrated Scientific Framework for Childhood Development. And I'm going to quote you from this article. They talk about actually the article is called an Integrated Scientific Framework for Child Survival and Early Childhood Development. And they talk about the necessary conditions for healthy brain development. I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs. That's all right?
Please.
The first paragraph says, we already talked about this one. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. In other words, the brain begins to develop in utero, but it continues to go into adulthood, and it's in those early years of brain development that all the templates are laid down for future function or dysfunction. So it's the foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follows. And in the second paragraph, when I'm talking about small t trauma or developmental trauma, this is what I'm getting at. Here's what they say. The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in early childhood years. In other words, the circuitry, chemistry, connectivity of the brain is critically influenced by the quality of adult-child relationships. So you can have childhoods where no overt trauma, the big T trauma, occurs, but when the parents are just too distracted, too stressed, too distressed, whatever's going on for them, to provide the child with that necessary responsiveness that the child needs, that can also traumatize the child. In other words, traumatize them in a sense that their emotions will also be frozen, that their responses will also be limited. They will also disconnect from themselves.
Yes.
And that small t developmental trauma is, I'm suggesting to you, is the prevalent condition in our society for many children. Not because the parents don't love them, but because of the stress on the parents themselves.
Yes. And when you talk to someone about that and what their childhood was like and how responsive their parents were, I often notice that people respond in a way where they defend the parent, saying, I was loved. My parents loved me. And you talk about that in, I'm sure, all of your books, but I definitely noticed it in When the Body Says No. That was a consistent theme.
Well, the answer certainly is. And when the body says no is about the relationship of physical illness to emotional stressors. So again, rheumatoid arthritis, cancer, lupus, scleroderma, colitis, Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, ALS. These are all responses to childhood emotional loss. And when your clients tell you, or people tell you, my parents loved me, it's true, the parents loved them. But we're not questioning whether the parents loved them or not. We're questioning how responsive were the parents able to be given their own stresses to the child. And in my experience, when I don't put it in terms of did they love you, because I'm assuming that the parents did love them. Parents love their kids. That's just how it is. We're not blaming the parents here.
Right.
No, nor are we suggesting, accusing them of not having loved their kids. But when you ask these adults with depression or anxiety or multiple sclerosis or any of these conditions that I mentioned, were you ever sad or upset as a child? Yes. Who did you talk to? The answer is going to be nobody. Or I talked to my friends or maybe my sister. And then the next question is, well, if you had a child who was sad or upset, who would you want them to talk to? And that's when the penny drops. That precisely when it came to sharing their most difficult emotions, they were quite alone. Not because the parents didn't love them, but because the parents were too traumatized, distracted, stressed, busy themselves. And so when the child is alone with difficult emotions, that's when trauma happens.
Yes.
And that will have manifestations in physical or mental illness later on.
So you have said, you and I talked about this for a couple moments before we started recording, how childhood trauma is really the root of most mental illness.
Yes. For example, I mentioned I worked with addictions for 12 years. in those 12 years in this very deprived area of Vancouver, where there's thousands of addicted people dependent on cocaine, crystal meth, heroin, a whole range of substances, in that 12-year period, I did not meet a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. And all the males had been traumatized overtly, in this case, either through sexual or other forms of abuse or neglect. That's my observation. Now, if you look at the large-scale studies on the question, it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. So that there are the very famous adverse childhood experiences studies, the ACE studies, that show that the more a child experiences physical, or what they call ACEs, adverse experiences are physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, death of a parent, violence in the family, addiction in the family, mental illness on the part of a parent, the parent being jailed, a divorce, or neglect. And for each of these adverse childhood experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. So that whether I'm talking about my own personal observations and multiple interviews with hundreds of people, or whether I'm talking about the large-scale population studies looking at thousands of people, we see that the template for addiction is not genetics, and it's not a choice that the person makes, but it's actually trauma. And it's so obvious because, well, let me try this experiment with you, if I may. Maybe we'll get somewhere, maybe we won't. But here's a question I ask people. I give them a definition of an addiction. So definition of addiction is any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure or relief in, and then suffers negative consequences, but doesn't give up despite those negative consequences. So pleasure, craving, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. So I don't know you personally, but by that definition, would you acknowledge that you've ever had any kind of an addiction in your life? And by the way, by addiction, I don't mean drugs. I mean any behavior. So that could be gambling, internet, sex, work, eating, shopping, or substances, or any number of other targets. By that definition, Laura, have you ever had an addiction in your life?
Yes. More than one.
I'm not going to ask you what it was or when it was. I'm going to ask you not what was wrong with it, but what was right about it. What did it do for you? What did you get from it?
Probably felt, depending on what it was, either comfort or sense of self-worth. Okay. So comfort meant that you felt uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Okay. And sense of self-worth means you lacked a sense of self-worth. Yep.
In other words, the addiction were not your primary problem. The addiction were actually your desperate attempt to solve a problem, which is of emotional discomfort and pain.
You got that right.
Okay. So talk about addiction as a disease, as a problem in the brain itself, rather than recognizing the addiction is actually, is anything wrong with wanting comfort? Anything wrong with wanting a sense of self-worth? In other words, your aspirations were perfectly normal, healthy human aspirations. You just didn't know how to get them. Why not? Well, for that, I'd have to look at your childhood. Something happened. Because every child has got worth intrinsically. And when we disconnect from that worth, there's a reason for that disconnection, and that's the trauma. And we're meant to be comfortable in our own skins. And when we're nurtured well, we are. When we're not nurtured well, then we're not. So the addiction is a secondary problem. The primary problem is the trauma that led to your discomfort with yourself and your rejection of yourself as not being worthy.
Yep. I know this is true. And I know this is true for so many people.
It's true for everybody who's got any kind of addiction. So therefore, to treat addiction like it was some kind of an inherited disease is scientific nonsense. Not to mention that the brain circuits that are not functioning in the adult very well, in the addicted adult, are actually shaped by early experience. And as I quoted to you that paragraph, the circuitry of the brain itself is shaped by our emotional interactions as they act on our genes. So whether you look at the physiology of the addicted brain, whether you look at the psychology of the addicted human being, you're looking at the impacts of childhood trauma. And it's not even, the science behind this is not even vaguely controversial. It's just that trauma is not taught in the medical schools. The word is not even mentioned in most medical schools. Doctors are not aware of this. They're not aware, physicians are not made to study the connections between the emotional system and the hormones and the nervous system and the immune system, even though it's not even that they're connected. They're one system. But that unity of mind, body is not taught in schools. Trauma is not taught very much in schools of social work, maybe in social work more than anywhere else, but certainly in the schools of psychology, education, the legal profession. None of these decisive professions really understand, learn about, or even aware of trauma. And therefore, when people come for help, the help they get is superficial.
Yes, and I think it can be very pathologizing.
Well, that's right, because now we tell the person with addiction, for example, or we can talk about ADHD a little bit if you like, but we can tell these people, no, you've got a disease. Well, it looks like a disease in some ways, but it's not primarily a disease. Primarily, it's a response to trauma. And as you heal the trauma, the manifestations that look like a disease will go away.
Right. Instead of treating the symptoms, treat the underlying problem, and then the symptoms get better.
That's right.
Please, let's talk about ADHD. I definitely am fascinated with what you have to say about that.
So if you look at what's happening right now, both in North America and Canada, US, and elsewhere in the globalized world, the rate of diagnosis of ADHD is going up. Now, ADHD is considered by the experts or so-called experts to be inherited genetic condition of the brain, just like addiction is. But that doesn't explain why it's growing or why it's developing in areas where it never used to be. Because genes don't change in a population over 10 or 15 years. So if many more kids are being diagnosed now, this can't be genetics. You might say it's because we know more about the condition. But actually, if you've been in the business long enough, you know that there's many more troubled kids now than there used to be. Teachers will tell you that. Psychologists will tell you that. Doctors will tell you that. So what's going on? Well, if you look at ADHD specifically, with which I've been diagnosed, and the subject of my first book, the American title of which is Scattered, How ADD Originates and What You Can Do About It. And I much prefer the original Canadian title, but that's another story. The hallmark of ADD is what? It's a tuning out. It's an absent-mindedness, which creates a lot of problems in life, as it has for me. Now, tuning out, and we talked about this earlier, is a normal human capacity. And why do we have the capacity? What was your answer to that?
Because we can't tolerate our emotions.
Because there's something that we can't tolerate of our emotional state at that time. In other words, when we're stressed. So tuning out is a normal human response to an abnormal situation. Now, if I were to stress you right now, you know, there's things you could do. You could just hang up on me. You could escape, in other words, right? Mm-hmm. Or you could fight back and just tell me to back off. And if you couldn't escape for some reason or couldn't fight back, you have another option yet, which is just get some help. This guy's bothering me. Help me, please. But if help wasn't available, if you couldn't escape or fight back, then you might tune out. Not you would, by the way. The brain does this automatically. So let's take the situation of a child like myself, a Jewish infant under Nazi occupation in Budapest in 1944, which is the story of my life. My mother is aggrieved because of the death of her parents in Auschwitz. She is terrorized because we may be deported and killed any time. And she is in a state of terrible anxiety because her husband is away in forced labor and she doesn't know if he's dead or alive. Now, when the mother is stressed, as I said earlier, the baby's stressed. What could I do about that stress? Fight back, escape, ask for help? No. What my brain did is it tuned out. But when did the brain tune out? When the brain was developing. So the tuning out becomes programmed into the brain. It's kind of the default setting. And the dopamine circuits that are there for motivation and attention don't develop properly because, again, the brain develops in interaction with the environment. So if we're looking at the preponderance of ADHD now, it's not because parents are not doing their best. It's not because parents don't love their kids, but because parents are so stressed, and therefore kids are so stressed in our modern society. Of course, more and more kids are having ADHD. What else would we expect? It's very straightforward. But again, the treatment industry and the experts see it purely as a biological brain disease, and therefore the only answer we have for it is medications, which, by the way, I've taken, and as a doctor, I prescribe them. I'm not against them, but they're not the answer. The answer is to look at the environment in which children are raised, and if a child comes to me with ADD, it's not the child I want to work on. I want to work on the family environment so that the less stress there is, the more the ADD can actually abate. And the same with adults, of course. So it's a developmental rather than a disease model, which calls for a different set of solutions.
Thank you for explaining that. And, and for sharing your story. You talk about how your mother was just unable to attend to your emotional needs. She couldn't. It's not that she didn't want to.
That's right. And by the way, so now you take my children, who are born in a very peaceful, prosperous place called Vancouver, Canada, where the father is a successful physician. There's no economic deprivation. There's no abuse. But the father's a workaholic because I got the message in that first year of life that I wasn't wanted because my mother was so unhappy. And when the mother's unhappy, the message the child gets is that it's all about him. So if I'm not wanted, then I can make myself cope with that by becoming a successful doctor where everybody wants me all the time. And I can't say no to anything because I need the validation so much. Now, what does that mean for my kids?
They're not getting you.
They're not getting me. They're not getting what they need from their father. And the mother's very stressed as a result. So now we've got the trauma passed on to another generation. And it's not that we didn't love our kids or do their best or that anything terrible happened. It's just that the way I was emotionally, because of my own childhood traumas and the way my wife was, created a certain atmosphere in the home that made it very tough on our children when they were small. And this is why we pass it on. And it's got nothing to do with love or intention or parental failure or anything like that. It's just the multi-generational transmission of trauma.
I'm so glad you said that phrase because I was going to ask you about that next, because we're hearing a lot recently about genetic differences in, for example, children whose parents were Holocaust survivors, finding differences in their DNA. And I interpret the way that people...
Sorry to interrupt. You're not finding differences in their DNA. You're finding differences in how that DNA is activated or not activated. In other words, the genes are the same, but the activation or the unactivation of the genes, that's what's passed on from one generation to the next. So that's called epigenetics.
Thank you for straightening me out on that. I didn't completely understand the way that it was being explained. And this could be my incorrect interpretation of what I've been hearing about this, but it seems as if the way it's being reported is this means that there is a biological difference for those children whose parents were in the Holocaust, and it has nothing to do with the environment they were raised in. It's physical, which I think seems totally untrue.
Well, yes, there's a biological difference, but not a genetic difference, an epigenetic difference. And not just the children, even the grandchildren. So these epigenetic effects got transmitted even to grandchildren. But the difficulty is, and it's true, and you can see those, and when you look at the epigenome, how genes are activated, it's going to be different. But you can't isolate it from the psychological environment either, because me being an infant survivor, I had certain emotional patterns and stresses that I acted out even without being affected by epigenetics. But how I was then affected my children. In other words, the same people that will carry the epigenetic markers of trauma will also carry the psychological emotional impacts of trauma, which they will also pass on to their offspring. So you can't separate the one from the other.
Yes.
And really, we don't need to. The only thing we have to understand is that much of what we see as humans in dysfunction is rooted in childhood trauma in the way I've defined it, whether it's developmental or overt trauma, and that these traumas, unless we intervene, are passed on unwittingly with the best of intentions from one generation to the next. And that finally, we live in a society that stresses people so much for so many reasons that a lot of children are being traumatized. And we're seeing the impacts of that in physical illness and in mental illness.
Yes. And I want everyone to know about this. And I'm so grateful that you came here so that you could explain that more. And at the same time, sometimes people become overwhelmed when they hear this information and they feel hopeless or really discouraged. But I think to me, it's a hopeful message.
Well, it's much more hopeful to recognize that these are developmental problems that we can grow out of at any age than to think that they're genetic diseases that we're saddled with them all our lives. I mean, which is more pessimistic.
I agree 100%.
Now, I'll tell people, but I'm glad you raised that because, it's a very serious message and people can find it overwhelming. The brain can develop new circuits and new ways of relating to life and oneself and the world, even later on in life, thank God. Because I often say, I'm 73, I just turned 73, but I'm glad I'm not as stupid as I was when I was 71, so even in this decade, my 8th decade, I can testify that there's potential for development and healing, and that's a lifelong process, but it's certainly available to everybody. The problem is, in order to heal, we have to recognize what the problem is. And so many of the treatment providers are trained in such a narrow technobiological model that healing is not offered to most of the people who need it, whether it comes to physical illness or again addictions and mental health issues. And by the way, I'm not here to reject the miracles of modern medical science. I'm a physician. I appreciate them more than most because I know about them maybe a bit more detail. I'm just saying that there's something else needed as well, and it's that something else that we're missing.
Yes, exactly. It's what we already have is great, and there needs to be some additional information, taught to everyone.
That's right.
So I know we have to wrap up. Can you tell people about ways that you are sharing your information? Because I know you have your 4 books and your website. You mentioned you may be developing a course.
Yes. So there's my website, www.drgabormate.com. That's DRGABORMATE. I've written the 4 books on addiction, on ADHD, on the mind-body unity and stress and health, when the body says no, the one you mentioned. I've also co-written a parenting book, which is called Hold On to Your Kids, again, about the importance of maintaining those adult attachments with children, so children don't by default have to meld into the peer group and lose their individuality and lose their potential for healthy development. That's called Hold On to Your Kids. These books are all mentioned and explained, and chapters are available for free at my website. I've given many talks which have shown up on YouTube. I travel and speak extensively in the U.S. and Canada and internationally, and people film these talks, and somehow or another they end up on YouTube. So those are freely available to anybody who can watch them, wants to watch them. And also, I'm one of the founders of a nonprofit called Compassion for Addiction. And I almost forget the website. It's either Compassion for, with the letter 4, addiction.com or .org or .net or .something. But
I'll find out what it is and put it on the show notes so we have it.
Thank you. But that nonprofit is dedicated to spreading a science-based, compassionate view of addiction as a trauma response, not as a bad choice that somebody makes or as a disease. And I will be offering an online course for therapists and whoever wants on addiction later on this year. We're filming that in June, and all the information will be available. So you can catch me through my speaking appearances throughout the States and Canada, and that's listed at my website, or through my YouTube or internet talks, or through my books.
Wonderful. I so appreciate you taking the time to be on Therapy Chat today, and I think that a lot of people are going to find this just immensely helpful, so I'm just so grateful to you.
Well, again, Laura, it's my pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to my interview with Dr. Gabor Maté. I am just amazed at his knowledge about the effects of trauma, stress on childhood development, and how it continues to affect us throughout our lifespan. You can find Dr. Gabor Maté's work on his website, drgabormate.com. I strongly encourage you to read his books, check out his TED Talk, and if you get the chance to hear him speak, oh my gosh, go for it. This episode is airing on Thursday, April 6th, and since April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I think it's a good reminder that childhood sexual abuse, which is much more pervasive in our culture than people realize, is something that can affect a child his or her whole life. And as this interview reminds us, addressing trauma is a key to health and well-being for the individual and for our society. So if you have experienced childhood sexual abuse, even if you're an adult now, it's not too late to get help. You will be surprised how much better you can feel. If you're in the Baltimore area, I specialize in helping people who've experienced any kind of sexual assault at any time during their lives. If you are not in the state of Maryland, I recommend that you check out the RAINN.org website, RAINN.org, where you can find a list of sexual assault crisis centers in your area who often provide free or very low cost counseling services for anyone who's experienced sexual assault, whether it was a few days ago or 75 years ago. So please know there is hope, and I encourage you to do what you can, whether or not you're a survivor of sexual abuse or sexual assault. I encourage you to do what you can to make a difference in ending sexual violence and childhood trauma. There's so many ways we can be involved. Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you, and I encourage you to keep your eyes out for my new Therapy Chat app. As soon as it's available, you'll find it on my website, therapychatpodcast.com, and hopefully by the time this airs, it may be live. Thanks so much for listening, and take care. Hey, it's Laura Reagan again. I wanted to talk to you a little bit more in depth about therapy notes. Now, if you've been listening to Therapy Chat for a while, you might remember last summer when I was doing the practice building series for therapists, I interviewed Brad Pliner, who's the CEO of Therapy Notes, in episode 43, and he talked about why therapists need practice management systems and the specific benefits of using Therapy Notes. So if you're thinking about it, that would be a great episode to check out. I'm currently using it in a trial period. Even though I loved my other practice management system that I've had for going on 4 years, I was finally persuaded to switch to Therapy Notes. I think it's going to add a lot of value to my business and be cost effective for me in the long run. You can get 10% off 12 months of Therapy Notes service using the promo code CHAT17. The first month of service, including claims, ERAs, and appointment minders, is completely free. So you get a free month and 10% off 12 months of service. So hope you'll check it out. Hi, I'm Laura Reagan, host of Therapy Chat, and I'm a trauma therapist in private practice outside of Baltimore. I specialize in helping clients with complex trauma related to childhood abuse or loss or attachment trauma during childhood. And I also specialize in helping survivors of sexual assault and childhood sexual abuse. So this is not easy work, and it can be very isolating, which is why I created 2 online communities for trauma therapists. Trauma Therapists Unite is a Facebook group that is secret and only for licensed clinicians. And the idea of Trauma Therapists Unite is a community and space for support and sharing resources, getting connected with other trauma therapists, and building your own network of people who support you, whether they're local to your area or not. I've made some great friendships online with other therapists through Facebook, but not all of them are trauma therapists. So I think there's a need for a space where trauma therapists can gather. And then when you want to do clinical consultation, since we can't do that in a Facebook group, you can say, hey, is anybody available at 5 o'clock to talk on the phone about a tough case I had? Or, hey, I'm available and I would love to support anyone who's seeking consultation today. Or, hey, you're in my area. Let's meet for coffee and brainstorm about our work and share support and connection. So Trauma Therapists Unite is a free Facebook group. For that purpose, it is not for clinical consultation because we cannot share client information in a Facebook group. We all know that. But because of the isolating nature of trauma work, especially when you're in private practice, but in agencies too, it can be very isolating because it's kind of the nature of trauma work. So with that isolating nature in mind, I created Trauma Therapists Unite for us to gather, support one another, and share resources. And I hope you will join us. There is a process to join the group that includes providing information about your credentials, and all of that information is in the group. So when you request to join, you'll see the rules. The other resource that I wanted to tell you about is a paid membership community, the Trauma Therapist Community, which includes online clinical consultation off Facebook using a secure platform of video sessions once a month and more if desired. And groups are also available in person. So check my website, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C.com/join for all the information about the Trauma Therapist Community. Thanks so much for your support. Hope to see you there.
Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat with your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. For more information, please visit therapychatpodcast.com.